The laser, as a technology, has affected most parts of society, including the scientific community, the military, the industrial as well as commercial sections of the economy, and the medical community. Yet while one would expect such an important device to garner a solid reputation, the laser has been shrouded in misconception, occupying a strange binary of either being cartoonishly impractical or excessively impressive. In spite of this reputation, the laser has had a massive impact on the modern world, almost as massive as its own myth, the myth of the laser. Hello. This is your host, Tubman. For this episode of the Ultra Podcast, we'll be talking about lasers. But first off, I'm not sure if there's going to be a Christmas episode, but if all of you are good, there might be, so keep on that nice list. And speaking of you guys, I was going over the stats of last episode, and we managed more than 80 views, which, considering how obscure the topic is, plus the fact that the channel is so new, I was a little surprised. That's all I'll say. However, there didn't seem to be much in the way of user engagement, in the way of likes and dislikes and comments, which, probably shouldn't be such of a surprise, considering the plurality of views came from people looking up a specific word. But, real G's tend to move in silence. Still, 80 views, doesn't look bad optics-wise. Speaking of optics, today we'll be going over lasers, specifically the impact of lasers on modern history and the public perception of lasers from the 20th century to the 21st century. So the first thing we have to get out of the way is that laser science is not synonymous with optical science. Optical science is the branch of physics that studies the behavior and properties of light. Laser science, is, the branch of optics describing the theory and practice of lasers. Lasers being a range of devices which emit light through a process of optical amplification based on the stimulated emissions of electromagnetic radiation. Lasers are a very specific coherent form of light. The spatial coherence allows the laser to have a specific kind of light that's very tight compared to normal light. It results in that very thin image of the laser that we know today. But the field of laser science actually predates the existence of laser devices. Albert Einstein wrote the foundational text for the maser and laser in the year 1917. The paper basically rederived Max Planck's laws of radiation using a new formalism based on probability coefficients, which we now call Einstein's coefficients, for spontaneous emissions, absorption, and stimulated emissions of electromagnetic radiation. In 1928, a person by the name of Rudolf W. Ladenburg would prove the existence of stimulated emissions. And in 1939, Valentin A. Fabricant, I think I'm saying that right, made the earliest known laser blueprint proposal. He provided specified conditions required for light amplification using stimulated emissions. And Willis E. Lamb in 1947, along with R.C. Rutherford, found apparent stimulated emissions in hydrogen spectra and effected the first physical demonstration of stimulated emissions. 3 years later, Alfred Kassler, who won the Nobel Prize in, I think it was 1966 in physics, he proposed the method of optical pumping, which was experimentally confirmed 2 years later by Brossel himself and Winter. The term laser originated as an acronym for light amplification by stimulated emissions of radiation. The first laser was built in 1960 by Theodore H. Maiman at the Hughes Research Laboratories. Based on the theoretical work done by Charles Hard Towns and Arthur Leonard Scalo, a lot of unpronounceable names here. Although the origin of the laser is slightly contested due to, multiple simultaneous projects that were happening at the time. And, for more information on that, I'm going to put a link in the description to a podcast episode done by a different podcast called The Man, the Myth, the Laser. But anyways, at the same time that the first real lasers were being made, a fantastical conception of lasers was being constructed in the minds of sci-fi readers by the entertainment industry. While early science fiction novels / comics had gone on about ray guns, X-ray beams, and everything else, it was television that really embraced the laser. Shows like Lost in Space and Star Trek had their characters wielding laser weapons, which were so small they could be held like a pistol. In a similar fashion to old, westerns. So why lasers? Well, it comes down to a few factors. People can't really see bullets. The exceptions being, of course, tracer rounds and the physical impact of the bullets on, say, something like concrete. And just war. It looks a lot cooler as a light show. No blood or gore, just disintegrations and burn animations. And this was an important consideration while America had very strict film codes. But the popularity of lasers would decline soon after the invention, began to burst the bubble a little. So why did the laser fall out of favor? Well, aside from those film codes I just mentioned, the basic limitations of lasers, that being the power inputs, were being revealed. And, there's an excellent paper done by a man by the name of J.L. Doty on this called The Laser Weaponsmith, and I will also link to that. It just made handheld lasers rather unbelievable, and, it just didn't work. The heat would probably make wielding the weapon by hand, far too difficult. It was part of a larger shift that was happening at the time in science fiction, in terms of transitioning towards harder science and more I don't want to say scientific realism, but, people wanted, they were growing up and they wanted a less childish sci-fi. And we can see this in things like anime, with something like Legend of the Galactic Heroes, as well as a novel like Dune, which is not exactly, I mean, some might call it pulp, but it's very very sophisticated science fiction. And this was mixed with a desire to diversify arsenals, within science fiction to really cash in on the blood and gore and man-to-man fighting that was now being allowed, And we see this a lot in Legends of the Galactic Heroes. You can't use lasers inside ships because the lasers will ignite a fuel battery, and that might, destroy the raiding party that's inside the ship. And so a lot of the combat is done with like axes and armor, and it's cool looking. And in Dune, there's a similar situation where if a laser hits a shield, there's a nuclear explosion. And so they don't use lasers against shields because they don't want nuclear explosions. And so you get this cool knife fighting where people slowly break through the shield with these methodical sort of dances. It looks like a dance if you see it in the new Dune TV show, or not TV show, but miniseries that came out, as well as the Dune movie, which I actually preferred. I think this was in the 80s. But anyways, and it's true, people really wanted to see the hand-to-hand fighting. I mean, even Star Wars, with the lasers and the spaceships, even that, they wanted to see sword fighting. They wanted to see, the real deal. And, people call, the lightsabers laser swords, which, apparently Star Wars fans think that's an insult, which might play into a larger myth that I will be addressing later. But it was just part of a phase, and people wanted new types of entertainment, more stimulating entertainment, and they got stimulating entertainment. So what we begin to see is two emerging narratives surrounding the laser. On the one hand, there is the dismissive narrative around lasers, where people don't view lasers as practical because of various drawbacks, and what I'd really put down as a lack of creative thinking. But you also have this astounding view of lasers, the view of a child overly impressed by cool lights. They're cool because, they're lasers, bro. And we see these two attitudes pervade throughout every kind of laser or conversation about lasers. This debate still goes on, which reminds me, I should probably explain the different kinds of lasers before I get to the different applications. So when people think of different kinds of lasers, most of the time they think of lasers with different kinds of color lights, red lasers, blue lasers, green lasers, each color a result of a different operational wavelength. But this superficial, / textbook understanding of lasers does a disservice to the real variety of lasers, which, actually range in the thousands. Lasers are better categorized by, and this is just my opinion, their pump source, laser medium, and specialized application. But since I don't have time to go over every single laser, I'll just be discussing the major types of lasers And usually these types actually, they tend to overlap a little. So we start off with a gas laser. A gas laser is a laser powered by an electric current that is discharged through a gas, to produce coherent light. You have a chemical laser. Chemical lasers are powered by chemical reactions. The medium is a little less relevant. They're pretty all-purpose. You also have excimer lasers. Excimer lasers are, similar to gas lasers. They use an electric current to power a special kind of, gas laser that moves through a unique tasing medium known as an excimer. To keep the science things brief, I'll just say that excimers are molecules where the atom is in an excited state. As of now, you only use noble gas compounds for excimer lasers. And I guess that's what really distinguishes them from the gas lasers. Next up, we have dye lasers. Dye lasers are lasers that move through an organic dye medium. That's just generally what they're about. They're used for a lot of interesting things, including like I'll just give an example: tattoo removal. And they have some interesting applications. They're also used in manufacturing, but they're a bit more specific in their use. A solid state laser, that's the next one. A solid state laser is a laser that uses a gain medium that is a solid, so like glass or crystals. I'm not sure if the Pink Floyd album is an example of that. Maybe that's just a prism, but it sort of gives you the concept. You're shooting something through something solid. And I think these are used in fiber optics is my guess. But anyways, on to semiconductor lasers. So when people talk about semiconductor lasers, they're actually usually talking about diodes, which are electrically pumped. So basically, the science in this is that a recombination of electrons and holes, created by the applied current, introduce optical gain. Reflections from the ends of the crystal form an optical resonator, and although the resonator can be external to the semiconductor, in some designs it's generally integrated. But in addition to these semiconductor lasers, there's actually a specific kind of laser which is used to make semiconductors, and I'd actually like to lump this in with the category of semiconductor lasers. And these lasers are used to make a lot of very small chips, because we've been increasingly making a lot of our electronics very, very small, to the point where you have to use things that don't apply much in the way of mechanical stress. And I'll get into this later when we cover the industrial applications of lasers. So those were the major categories. There are other laser categories, both present and hypothetical. But these are generally for specific scientific experiments. And so their main application is that they're used by scientists in labs. They aren't really that commercial, they're academic. And so I guess that's how you'd categorize the miscellaneous set of lasers, yeah. So now let's get on to the applications of lasers. So weapons, while the laser gun might have fallen out of favor in science fiction, the laser in the military still had a massive role to play, and is still being built upon to this day. most of our guided missiles are guided by some type of laser system. Laser sights are found on many firearms nowadays, and not just for CQC and hip fire, but also for long-range shooting. Modern laser-based rangefinders are a critical component for accurate target acquisition / execution, whether it's calculating the range for a 50 cal or for a howitzer. And all that brings me to the next topic, one of the biggest military projects to involve lasers, SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. So what was the Strategic Defense Initiative? In 1983, Ronald Reagan announced the creation of the SDI program. SDI was an unfinished missile defense program whose explicit aims were to protect the United States from ballistic strategic nuclear weapons in general, ICBMs in particular. This had come on the heels of Nike Zeus / Nike Hercules, Sentinel, and the Safeguard programs, which were the previous administration's attempt at a ballistic missile countermeasure. The main problem with these countermeasures was that the cost-exchange ratio of defense was unfavorable for the needs of the American government. All it appeared to do was increase Soviet military spending, and, it didn't really seem like these would be good ways of defending the U.S. from a nuclear attack. But Ronald Reagan really changed the game when it came to SDI, creating the beginnings of a set of cost-effective countermeasures enabled by a more efficient combination of supercomputers and satellites. We'll be going over each program individually, although there is overlap between some of these programs. So the first program was Project Excalibur, which was an X-ray laser program. The program was hoping to use X-ray lasers powered by nuclear explosions to destroy multiple weapon delivery systems at once. The physics, behind this are kind of crazy, but basically, in a nuclear explosion, there are a lot of X-rays produced which create these small nuclear spikes. This is known as nuclear molting. The idea is to focus these X-rays to make several large nuclear spikes, which would target missiles. This would decrease the cost-exchange ratio in favor of defense, because you'd be killing multiple missiles with just one nuclear explosion. It had been possible, or had been theorized at least, that you could use the explosion from a nuclear missile, the fireball itself, to shoot down maybe one nuclear missile. But this was, just if you want to picture this, if you've ever played missile defense, the strategy of saturating the sky with nuclear explosions to blow up the warheads prematurely. But this system would use one nuclear explosion to basically chain kill a bunch of other nuclear missiles. Next, we have the Miracle program, which was a chemical laser system. It stood for Mid-Infrared Advanced Chemical Laser, and it was a military program to develop a laser that could, destroy a missile. So instead of using lasers that were made from the explosion of a nuclear bomb, this was a multi-use chemical laser that could be fired again and again, instead of like a one-time use. In 1985, it successfully destroyed a Titan missile booster, but SDI planned something far more ambitious. They were going to put chemical lasers onto satellites to intercept incoming missiles. The problem was that, it costs a lot of money to put stuff into space, especially if it's big. And lasers are big. Effective lasers are big. And add to that, each of these lasers would require refueling and maintenance. And the costs, you can see them begin to go up. You'd have to not only be shipping laser, but laser munitions and laser maintenance crews and laser equipment to space in order to just keep these systems running. But they figured out that there was a more cost-effective way of doing this, and that was to keep the laser on the ground. Instead, they would have satellite mirrors that could reflect the laser beam towards the direction of the nuclear missile. And all that you'd really have to do was you just have to adjust the satellites ever so slightly to aim the mirror at the desired target, which, being a nuclear missile. Next on the list, there's the neutral particle beams. The Soviets had developed a large amount of decoys and dud missiles, which would take up a nuclear countermeasure. And these were in the form of MIRVs, which they're like missiles that carry more missiles. And they split apart into a bunch of smaller missiles that make it very difficult to catch all of them. And some of these missiles were dud missiles. They weren't even actual nuclear missiles. They were just they would just blow up, but there would be no nuclear explosion. And if you use your countermeasures on these, you're really wasting a lot of material. And the solution to this was the neutral particle beams. The neutral particle beam would basically shoot a laser at the nuclear warheads / duds in order to determine if it was giving off neutral particles, i.e. gamma radiation. If the missile was a dud, it wouldn't give off neutral particles because there's no nuclear payload in there. But if it was a nuclear missile, it would give off neutral particles. And that's how you could tell if a missile was real or if it was a dud. And, to some extent, you could even determine how many, like if the missile was a MIRV and it did have multiple missiles within it, because I guess you could distinguish between a nuclear warhead that was giving off one missile's worth of gamma radiation as opposed to a missile that was giving off 4 warheads worth of nuclear radiation. But you also had laser sensors, and these were a wide variety of laser scanners, not like the neutral particle beams, but these were more part of the Brilliant Eyes program. The first of these was the Boost Phase Surveillance and Tracking System, the BSTS. These lasers would scan and would detect the heat plumes created by launch and boost phase. And basically, its job would be to isolate the missile from the heat plume. and so that you could target the missile and not just hit the fireball that was forming under the missile. The second system was the Space Surveillance and Tracking System, the SSTS, which in addition to tracking missiles in space could track atmospheric missiles from space. These lasers, in conjunction with supercomputers, would assist even more advanced programs that were part of SDI. For instance, the hypervelocity railgun, known as Checkmate, was a program that, yes, it did create a railgun that was bound by a satellite, which would shoot ICBMs in the boost phase. And in order to actually hit the missile, instead of hitting the flames, you would need the previously mentioned BSTS in order to distinguish between the heat plume and the missile. You'd also have programs like Brilliant Pebbles. In order, they really were pebbles compared to the other systems involved, and you're trying to hit a rocket that's moving very fast with what effectively is like a air-to-air missile, and that really changes the game a little. And these missiles, which are basically rocks, needed to know the exact time and the exact speed the missile is moving in order to properly connect with, said missile. And that would require the Space Surveillance and Tracking System. So SDI was making real gains in the field of defensive countermeasures. However, liberal academia/media were very dismissive of SDI. Ted Kennedy and the Washington Post called it a reckless Star Wars scheme. Some Roosevelt/Truman era physicists, Hans Bethe and Richard Garwin, made statements about the infeasibility of a defensive shield. And, the Union of Concerned Scientists denied the utility of X-rays in ballistic missile defense. However, I think of all the complainers and underminers, I think Carl Sagan was probably closest on the money. When he went to the USSR to get the Russian perspective, the Russians were apparently saying that SDI was a form of economic warfare to get the Soviets to put more money into military spending. And, it's hard to tell when the Russians are speaking honestly or if it's the party line, but I think in this case it's a little bit of both. Just looking at the Russians empirically, we can see that they continue to make new missiles and considered the program to be somewhat of a possible threat, at least in private. That's what they were saying. But things weren't really that clear. I mean, you have to look at this from the Russian perspective, and understand the Soviet mindset. Yes, the American media was saying the program wasn't working, but who owned the capitalist American media? Why, the capitalist Americans who ran the capitalist government. And if the capitalist American government had a program that would be a threat to the Soviet Union, then the capitalist American government would tell the capitalist American media to pretend that it wasn't viable. And so the Soviet, Union continued to take that threat very seriously, and continued their regime of high military spending. And you might wonder why, if the Soviet Union knew that, the U.S. was trying to get them to bankrupt themselves on, military spending, why would the Russians play into that? And it's because the Russians really thought that they could compete with America economically. I mean, they didn't think that they were the same size in terms of economy, but they believed that the Soviet system in the long term would have a superior output to the American system. But in the end, they couldn't. They actually, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of military spending, amongst other things. And in this, we really see how Reagan changed the game. Instead of attempting to beat the Soviets on a technical level, the conditions for victory were that the Soviet Union bankrupt itself with military spending. There's a lot that can be said about Ronald Reagan, but I'll keep it brief and I'll just say this. Part of being a great communicator is being a great bluffer. That requires an understanding of how people think, being articulate in your speech, also being careful, and saying what you think they want to hear and playing into what they're thinking. And in that sense, Reagan was the great communicator. For all the talk of Maskarovka and Russian disinformation, the American government and its armed forces is probably one of the leaders in military deception across the world, with considerably more human capital and financing than almost any government ever. And there are U.S. military officials who have claimed much of the media controversy and exaggerated claims about, the Strategic Defense Initiative were an attempt to get the Soviet spies to reveal themselves by feeding specific false information to small groups of people. But anyways, the Soviet Union no longer exists, and we should begin thinking how these technologies affect us now in the present, using the perspective we have on the past. So right now, let's go over two smaller examples of the myth of the laser in action. Going into more modern history, 2011 brought us We the People, a website with great ambition for bringing us toward a more direct democracy, something like Switzerland. Yet the petition for a U.S. stimulus Death Star in 2012 really shot that initiative in the foot. The government gave a joking response in the form of a memo as to why the U.S. government couldn't afford a Death Star. And, the people laughed at that joke. But really, they had sowed the seeds of destruction for We the People. The petition website would have two more major petitions, the Sandy Hook one and the cell phone unlocking petition. But, besides those, We the People would not really gain much traction. And, I think democracy, or at least this direct form of democracy, was immediately killed because really politicians lost respect for the people. They had this conception of the people as being this mature entity in their mind. And, all it took was realizing that people wanted a Death Star. And really, at that moment, any conception that the people were something worth respecting went out the window with politicians. And we see this now in the pandemic era where, they don't respect us at all. They don't respect their voters. So, the Biden administration, in 2000, I think it's either 2020 or 2021, shut down the We the People website permanently during his presidency. You know, if that's not symbolic of something, I don't know what is. But anyways, that was the effect of the Death Star on direct democracy within the United States. Although there was another effect of the Death Star petition, and I think that was in communicating to the elites that the American people would approve of a space-bound military. Because during the Trump administration, we would get the formal creation of Space Force. And, you know, obviously we had satellites in the military long before Space Force was a thing. But now that, you know, people seem to be more interested in space, you know, there's more approval for initiatives like Space Force, and for it getting its own military branch, its own special staff, its own money, and its own everything. So, you know, speaking of feds in space, we're going to get to the next smaller example of the myth of lasers influencing modern society. And that comes in the form of directed energy weapons. You know, we're seeing increasing speculation that directed energy weapons are being used in wildfires, along with other natural disasters. You know, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene claiming Jewish space lasers are, you know, responsible for the wildfires. Which I'll just say this, you know, the federal government does not need a laser to start a fire. In fact, all you really need is an arsonist, a lighter, and some gasoline, you know. The federal agencies can be audited, you know, and it's pretty hard to hide a multi-million-dollar laser system in a budget. However, one guy and some gasoline, you know, that literally can be written off as an employee and his gas money. Although, you know, I'm not sure if the government really minds people thinking that they have the resources to run an extensive laser system that starts wildfires. And I would take a guess they're probably leaking some of this fake information to throw people off. Indeed, it's rather astounding to see people talk about the danger of wildfire lasers when there are very real dangers posed by less destructive lasers that almost anyone can get their hands on. Across the country, there are increased incidents of laser-induced crashes, you know, where lasers blind pilots or drivers. And hypothetically, you know, it wouldn't be too hard for any delinquent who's good with tools to build an unregistered laser. It's incredibly illegal. Don't do it. But, you know, they could aim it into a busy intersection or a highway and cause tremendous damage just by, I don't know, aiming it into a cockpit of a passenger jet when it's landing or taking off. Because, you know, most people don't know this, but the majority of plane crashes happen during landings or taking off. You know, the ones where they get shot down in the sky or they break in the sky are actually quite rare in the grand scheme of things. That being said, while Jewish space lasers don't exist, I can confirm the existence of Jewish ground lasers. They do exist. The Tactical High Energy Laser System, or the FEL system, is used to blow up rockets that are shot from what I'm assuming is Palestine at Israelis. So yes, Jewish lasers do exist. But putting it into space would probably be far too costly for a country as small as Israel. And, you know, no amount of no amount of American money would support a system like that. Like, think about the speed of a laser versus a projectile-based ammunition. Light is faster, and straight up, light will always be faster, you know? And you may not need the full force of a bullet to get the desired effect. Maybe all you need to do is melt a fuel cell on an ICBM, and your mission's already accomplished because it can't make the trip all the way to, mainland United States. Or maybe you're melting the optics/computer on a fire and forget missile that's, following one of your aircraft. And we can look at the military applications of lasers nowadays, and we can see that they aren't even preferred for their kinetic abilities. Laser painters are used, to guide missiles to a present target, because you can't exactly go in and throw smoke into a military formation. That person would just get shot immediately. And unlike, a smoke designator, when you designate something with a laser painter, the mark follows the target even if the target moves, because guess what? The mark is the target. You are heating up the designated target with special lasers. Lasers can also measure distances and are integrated into rangefinder artillery auxiliaries, which are important for quickly calculating the trajectory of moving targets, combined, of course, with speed lasers. If you've ever dealt with the police, you'll understand what these things are. They basically shoot a laser to see how fast you're moving, and by combining the trajectory of a moving target with the range and the speed at which the target is moving, you can estimate where it will be and what you will need to do in order to shoot it with something like an artillery piece. And one note about the LiDAR technology quickly. LiDAR is actually used in a lot of fields, which, it's generally used for similar purposes, but it's worth noting that it's not just used for law enforcement/military applications. There's a lot of uses for LiDAR, but we're going over lasers generally. So anyways, in terms of close quarters combat, laser sights are used for target acquisition, because the thing about laser sights is that they're not limiting your range of vision in the way an optics would. Optics, they're housed in some type of plastic or something, and that can limit the amount of vision that you actually have, even if you see farther. And not to mention, you're probably usually aiming with one eye, which makes things a little more difficult in terms of depth perception, which is critical for CQC. And I speculate that sometime in the future, we will develop a kind of laser that will prevent friendly fire incidents, because the laser will not fire the gun if the laser is pointed at a friendly. Like, the friendly will have a unique laser signature. Whereas if it's anyone else, you'll be free to fire the gun, and this will have pretty large implications for friendly fire in the future, in terms of preventing it. I mean, it probably won't, because a lot of friendly fire is now done with frag grenades, but that's a different story. The next thing, mining. I think when people imagine lasers in mining, they think of coal-faced miners shooting laser drills at mineral veins, or large spaceships taking apart asteroids with laser beams. But this is not a likely thing, Just for starters, laser drills could ignite dangerous material within a mine that puts the miners at risk when they're taking out minerals. There are also big upfront costs, training, You have to train the person to use the laser drill and all the other parts of the logistics. Manufacturing, you have to start making these drills, and then you have to make each individual component, which requires another line of logistics. Carrying a laser cannon, if you're just, think about how you're going to get this thing inside of a mine shaft. It would be ridiculous. It's heavy. It might be a little delicate. And imagine if there's a cave-in. Imagine how much money you just lost because your laser got crushed to death. And just compare that to carrying in a box of explosives. It's not even a competition. You just get a guy, have him carry the sticks of TNT to the designated location, and then plant the TNT into the desired location. But ironically, the best role for lasers in mining would be mine safety. Specifically, they would be used to detect dangerous gases in the air. The mining laser wouldn't have to be strong enough to, interact with dangerous gases. You wouldn't want it to ignite the gas, but just looking at the way the laser reflects off the gas, you could detect the dangerous gases without igniting anything, and then a machine would read that data and then send a warning to the coal miners. And laser mapping would also probably be a safer way of mapping out a cave, because you don't have a guy going into dangerous places taking in measurements, when you could just have a laser, giving you an idea of what you're looking at. And then from there, you can make a decision as to whether or not you want to put a guy there. Or if it's too dangerous, you sort of try to collapse that area of the mine with minimal issues. So like a controlled collapse. And here again, we see the perception of lasers versus the reality that really you can use these things for modern uses. You just have to be creative about it, and you can't play into these ideas. So even though lasers aren't used extensively in material extraction, lasers play a big role in material processing and other industrial work. The plurality of industrial lasers are for laser cutting. Lasers are also used in welding and marking metal. But by far the most important part of lasers are the two semiconductor lasers I mentioned. And this has mostly to do with the fact that semiconductors are so important to modern electronics, which are important to the modern world. They only represent 14% of laser industry, but these lasers aren't the optional ones. You can cut something with a saw, but if you're trying to use what is the alternative to your laser diode inside your smartphone? It's not there. And in terms of manufacturing semiconductors, they're actually even more important. Lasers are a key part of PCB manufacturing, and it's complicated, but basically, in order to avoid applying mechanical stress to the prospective semiconductor, they use UV laser light for the exposing process that carves away the photoresistant top layer of the wafer. And because of how small these chips have gotten, you can't use a mechanical process like a saw or like just normal tools. You have to use these sort of cutout prints. But ironically, because these semiconductors are getting so small, we may not even be using lasers in the future. We may be using subatomic reactions because, just by the nature of how small electronics have to get, we're literally like moving around very small particles. It's not even like it's not even something you could see anymore. Next up, we have medicine. Often when people think of lasers and health, they think about the ocular damage that can be caused by eye exposure to lasers. However, lasers are actually one of the prime tools for eye surgery. I think it's called LASIK, and basically after the proper preoperative measures are taken, they use a series of lasers to correct your eye. First, using a femtosecond laser, you create a hinged flap in the Bowman's layer of the eye. The flap is carefully lifted while the Eczema laser remodels the corneal stroma, carefully vaporizing very small, parts of the eye without creating too much damage. After the proper corrections are done, the area is checked for air bubbles or debris, after which point the flap is repositioned for healing. Sometimes this even involves a laser, but anyways. And after that, the patient receives, post-operative treatment, like bandages, sunglasses, eye drops, and other medicines. But there are, and don't try this at home, by the way. This is something doctors do. Consult a doctor before doing LASIK. But there are many more uses for lasers in medicine, each with their own advanced applications. Lasers are used in medical imaging, whether it's laser mammography, that's the examination of breasts, optical coherence tomography. Basically, imagine using lasers to create these 2D and 3D images of body parts. They're used in cancer diagnoses. And this was the interesting one. Going back to the SDI program, they used lasers to identify dud missiles, but doctors can use that same technology to identify tumors because tumors have a unique structure. It's unique compared to the entire body, and they absorb light on different wavelengths. And this means that if you use a specific laser, at specific wavelengths, you can target and destroy tumors. Lasers are also used in angioplasty, which is basically when you take a catheter and you put it within a vein or artery to improve blood flow. Conventional angioplasty uses a balloon catheter to expand the veins and arteries, basically bypassing the whole issue of the blockage. Now, this may improve the blood flow. However, there are risks. For one thing, embolization. The balloon may cause the blocking material to move into the rest of the bloodstream. It might get launched out and cause downstream damage. Also, inflating your veins isn't the best for your vein structural integrity, and this can lead to long-term problems down the line. Not to mention, disproportionate balloons could cause bad bleeding, and the bleeding could, internal bleeding. The reason it's different from external bleeding is that external bleeding, you can see it, you can address it immediately. Yes, it can be very, very dangerous if you're bleeding out and, you're about to die. But internal bleeding is a lot more insidious and a lot more dangerous because, it can push around things. The blood is not leaving you. It is simply moving to a part of the body where it's not supposed to be. And the blood could disrupt your brain, by you have bleeding in your brain and it's pushing things around. It could be applying pressure to an organ or a vein, and this has this could have horrible consequences. All bleeding tends to have horrible consequences, but this is particularly concerning. So anyways, with laser angioplasty, you're changing things up. Laser angioplasty uses a laser catheter to melt the blockage within the vein. So instead of targeting the whole vein itself, you're actually targeting the actual blockage. And, this means that you're not damaging the integrity of the vein by inflating it. You're just clearing it out. But, this comes with its own set of risks. There might not be the same type of damage, but there's still little bits of damage that are possible, from what I understand. I think it comes down to possible radiation, with bad equipment, but it's a lot more complicated. See a doctor. Anyways, lasers are used in dermatology, not just for the previously mentioned cancer treatments, but for things which would be a lot less obvious, like tattoo and hair removal. In both processes, lasers of a particular wavelength target things, whether follicles or ink deposits below the skin. Sticking to cosmetic lasers, you also have lasers that are used in plastic surgery, which are used for a form of heat-based laser liposuction in order to make someone, I guess, slimmer or just, less fatty. Lasers are used in a number of surgeries. You got frenectomies, and this primarily covers the subject of laser surgeries in dentistry, but basically they remove a small fold of tissue called the frenulum, which prevents organs from moving too far within the body. Because like I mentioned before, displacement causes tertiary problems that, affect your body in negative ways. You have lithotripsy. This is one the guys will definitely be interested in hearing about. It's the destruction of kidney stones. So instead of having to, piss it out, you just blow up the kidney stone, which might sound like an appealing option till you sort of realize the costs involved. And anyways, you also have prostatectomy, which is the removal of the prostate gland. And basically you're using a laser to cut it out and then you remove it. Before, the laser existed, these surgeries did exist. However, the thing about lasers is that, when you cut with a laser, you're simultaneously cauterizing the cut. So you're not leading to that aforementioned bleeding. You're cutting and then sealing immediately, which is why so many hospitals are buying lasers now. And actually, you can buy a lot of powerful lasers online, but you should be careful because a lot of these lasers are stronger than they actually appear sometimes. That's why you should always use the right safety equipment. There's a subreddit on... in fact, I might actually post this episode to that subreddit, but they can give you a lot of pointers to laser science and laser safety. Yeah, it's important to just verify that your product is safe, because you don't want to accidentally blind yourself with one of these. Because, not everyone that's doing these commercial interactions are doing them in a positive way, So putting aside the product for a second, lasers are used in a wide variety of, commercial interactions. In vending machines, lasers are used to identify coins, indicate when a bag has fallen into the receptacle. There used to be a time when vending machines didn't always fully dispense snacks, and people could get away with feeding them fake bills and fake coins. That time has passed. We live in different times now, different times that have been so greatly changed by the laser. But the convenience of more efficient vending machines was nothing compared to the effect of lasers on cashiers. Barcodes, specifically barcode scanners, help cashiers since they don't have to memorize as many items. Now, if you've never worked in retail, you might not realize how much of a time saver this was. You might say that this is mundane. But if you're President George H.W. Bush Sr., this was a pretty big deal. In Bush's second election run, he visited a grocery store to get closer to the common people, because, he was perceived as an aristocrat, which, he kind of was. But this backfired tremendously. It's his astounded attitude toward the barcode laser scanner that he just marveled at it. It alienated him from a lot of normal voters, and ultimately cost him, amongst other things, it cost him the election to, I think it's Bill Clinton. Now, people often talk about the legacy of his son, George W. Bush, but I don't think people fully grasp the depths of George H.W. Bush. Like, this guy was the director of the CIA, ambassador to the United Nations, vice president to that guy I mentioned before, Ronald Reagan. He was this guy's right-hand man. He was the RNC chairman, and he was the president that negotiated possibly one of the most harmful deals to the American people, NAFTA. And, if you're not convinced from those credentials that this guy was a very dangerous individual, I encourage you to listen to his New World Order speech that really says it all about the guy. This guy is like the conspiracy in chief. I don't think people really comprehend how different our country would have been had he been reelected. But moving away from barcodes, let's talk about something that's probably more directly relevant to your life, laser-based communications. While people had light-based communication devices like signal lamps and heliographs, these were niche devices primarily employed by the military. But with the invention of the laser, the Earth saw three new inventions that pushed laser-based communication into the commercial market, the consumer economy. First off, we have fiber optics, where basically you shoot small lasers from light-emitting diodes through transparent fiber cables. It might be solid state. You do this through glass or plastic, but these are generally wrapped in extensive coating, extensive layers, because some of these are being laid across the ocean, so they have to be very very well protected. But just to give you an idea of how small these are, they're like slightly larger than a human hair, and the messages and signals that are communicated through these fiber optics are dependent on a combination of fibers that light up with certain lasers at certain times. The second type of laser-based communication is direct laser dish communication. Basically, what you have is a set of laser links to give out laser-based information. So they're shooting it out, and then each of them, receive the information via one large receptor dish as an intake mechanism for the laser-based information. Unlike fiber optics, you're not using any specific medium, but instead you're shooting it through the air. I get it. The air itself is a gas. It's just a breathable gas. But for all intents and purposes, this is a free medium. And branching out from that technology, we got the satellite laser communication. Partially developed from the discoveries of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Satellite laser communication is basically a more complicated free space optical communication that can function outside of an atmosphere and communicate through the atmosphere. But what makes that a little more unique is that you're dealing with certain temperatures. Like, yes, you're not dealing with a gain medium, but you're dealing with a certain level of cold. You're dealing with a certain distance, and you're dealing with breaking through the atmospheric barrier, which requires a certain amount of modulation. Laser beams have, even reached into exploration and discovery. On the one hand, we get to the genetic level. Lasers are a critical component of DNA sequencing. In combinatorial probe anchor synthesis, which is its own thing, basically you're sequencing DNA. But the part that's relevant to us is that lasers are basically used when you're picking out individual nucleotides. Lasers scan the nucleotides and they cause fluorescent emissions, which can be captured by cameras that turn it into data. And this process makes it a lot easier to get a lot more data sets, because it's not just some person interpreting the data, it's now a computer interpreting the data. And then instead of doing all these scans individually, with a person, the person is simply reading the results of a bunch of machines. And so this can happen a lot faster, which with DNA that's ever changing, you do need it to be ever faster. Lasers are also used in mass spectrometry in combination with a matrix compound. To simplify that, that's an ionizer. A laser is used to desorb the given sample, and that's basically the point of mass spectrometry. Let's see here. In addition to surveying human DNA, lasers are used to survey land. A lot of these rangefinders and leveling devices that are used by the military were carried over into the civilian sector, primarily for surveying property and geology. You can also use it for archaeological work, I suppose, but, since we kind of used up a lot of the surface level resources, modern energy companies have had to do a lot of resource exploration in places that, require lasers, because there's a lot of ground to cover. And we don't just use lasers to survey the ground, we also use lasers to survey the stars. Astronomers had always been able to look at the stars through things like telescopes, but people would always have to adjust for, errors in the astronomical measurements. And it turned out these were caused by, atmospheric distortions. However, with sky-directed lasers, you can correct for these errors. A lot of this technology was developed by the program I mentioned, the Strategic Defense Initiative, in order to properly align ground-based lasers with satellite mirrors. As wonky as that sounds, a lot of important technology was derived from that seemingly trivial task. Laser-propelled exploratory vehicles. I think that, and this is just speculation here, that the use of lasers in exploration might actually get a lot more literal than people think, because, as laser infrastructure develops, the possibilities begin to expand. A laser beam could hypothetically be used to transfer heat to a boiler, because, that's fundamentally what a laser is. A laser is heat because it's light. This could hypothetically power a vehicle. Perhaps a laser-powered hot air balloon could allow for prolonged high-altitude exploration without refueling. And you could even, create from that a sort of low-altitude satellite. Because, as debris increases from the amount of, abandoned satellites we have in space, or meteors, space just might not be feasible for people who want to work on a smaller scale, And that's not even bringing up the effects of cosmic radiation, which, who knows what effect that's having on the people who work in space, and as well as their equipment, And so we might see low-altitude satellites in the future. But anyways, entertainment, laser tag allows for a somewhat safer and more affordable alternative to paintball, because I don't know about you, but getting shot with a paintball is not a great experience. Although that being said, paintball is a very fun game. And lasers, I think the equipment for laser tag is, a lot cheaper, because you're not, your ammunition is energy. It's not necessarily cartridges of paintballs that have to be manufactured, you don't have to use these air canisters. And while, a laser gun might not be feasible, the type of phaser that you see in Star Trek, something like a barcode scanner, a high-powered barcode scanner that could be held in hand like a pistol, actually is kind of feasible if your needs are just, to indicate that someone was hit by a hypothetical laser beam, in a game of laser tag. Lasers are also seen in music with things like laser harps. Now, these aren't nearly as cool as some other inventions, which I will mention in later videos, but basically you have these harp strings that are lasers, and they play a preset noise whenever you interrupt the laser beam within the laser harp. And because we have that speed gun technology that I was talking about before, these lasers can actually detect the speed at which you're hitting the laser note, and so they can play different notes depending on how fast you touch the lasers. But the most prominent, and by far the most prominent use of lasers in entertainment is in the party scene. if you've been to a rave, you've probably seen a laser. But why are laser lights and smoke, all that fancy light show stuff used at events like raves and concerts? On the one hand, it looks pretty cool. It's a nice thing to look at. But I think what's more important is what we don't see because of the lasers. The laser light hides the fact that you might be partying in a pretty cruddy warehouse or a dirty field, or just some abandoned area that looks really crappy without good lighting. You get distracted by the pretty lights, and hopefully while you're sort of partying, you don't notice all the weird things that are happening, like say if some guy's dealing drugs, or if people are throwing up because they've had a little too much to drink, or you're just you're distracted by the light show. I think anyone who remembers the Astro World event understands why that might be important, or why that might be deadly. But anyways, so they're shooting lasers at people's eyes, and that's kind of bad for people's eyes. So basically, rave technicians have developed a special method called audience scanning in order to minimize the damage or the potential damage for people's eyes. Audience scanning happens when laser beams are being directed towards observers in a light show of some sort or a display. Maybe like a laser tunnel, for instance. In order to avoid dangerous levels of laser radiation, they basically have the lasers moving really fast across the audience, and it's not a constant beam of lasers. It's actually blinking. Sometimes it blinks really slow, but most of the time it's blinking fast enough for you not to notice. But basically that minimizes the amount of actual laser that's hitting you. And to make sure that the effects on the eye are minimal, they might not even necessarily direct it towards the crowds. Maybe they'll direct it upwards at the ceiling, or they'll reflect it off of something. But the danger is, if the scanning mechanism fails, because, you can't really distinguish with the naked eye sometimes a laser mechanism that is working and a laser mechanism that is failing, because they both just look like a laser, because your eye can't really process how fast the laser is blinking or if it's not blinking. So it is possible for people to get a certain level of eye exposure that could be damaging. But I don't think people really care about all that, to be perfectly honest. I think people want to get caught up in the myth of things, They want to be blinded by the light show. Stay tuned for the preview of episode 2.